Section 6 of Practical Forestry in the Pacific Northwest by Edward Tyson Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Forestry and the Forest, Part 3. Seeding and Planting. Seed supply. It has been shown in a previous chapter that the owner of deforested land who desires to secure a second crop may find it necessary or cheaper to adopt artificial measures wholly or in part, instead of depending upon natural reproduction. These measures may be of two kinds: direct seeding, in which the seed is sown where the trees are to stand permanently, and the planting of trees grown in nurseries. Whether artificial reforestation is accomplished by means of sowing seed or planting trees, the first requisite is a supply of tree seed of the desired species and of good quality. Unfortunately for the timber owner who wishes to enter upon extensive seeding operations, the business of collecting and preparing forest tree seed for market has received but little attention from old established seed firms, and it is not always possible to purchase the species and quantity desired. Moreover, the prices charged are often excessive. In the Pacific Northwest, however, the demand for the seed of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce has led to the establishment of a considerable trade in these species, and at reasonable prices, so that where these species are to be used, or only small quantities of other species, the timber owner will probably find it to his advantage to purchase the seed rather than to attempt collecting it himself. Douglas fir seed is quoted at $1.40 to $2 per pound, and Sitka spruce seed at $2.25 to $3. In purchasing seed, it is common practice to specify that it shall be of the new crop, because tree seed kept in ordinary storage loses its vitality materially. When properly stored in airtight receptacles, however, as is now done by some seed dealers, it will retain its germinative power for several years with only slight depreciation. Moreover, fresh seed, if improperly treated, may be of very poor quality, so that the age of the seed is of little value in the determination of its worth, and the only sure method of ascertaining this is by means of germination or cutting tests. The latter method is the quickest and most simple, and consists of cutting open a number of the seeds and ascertaining the % whose kernel is sound, plump, and moist. Seed of good average quality should contain not more than 25 to 30% of infertile seed. When seed cannot be purchased, it is necessary to collect. Since no species of coniferous trees bear abundant crops of seed each year, and often several seasons will elapse between good crops, it is necessary to gather sufficient seed when the supply is abundant to provide for succeeding years when the crop is apt to be a failure. The seed ripens in the fall, usually during August or September, and the cones should be collected at that time. Pines require 2 years in which to mature the seed, that is, the cones are not fully formed and the seed ripe until the second fall after the fertilization of the flowers in the spring. Most of the other important conifers ripen their seed in the fall of the same season. Shortly after the seed is ripe, the cone opens and allow it to disseminate, consequently they must be gathered before this occurs. The cones are gathered either by climbing the trees and cutting them off from the branches, by picking from the tops of felled trees, or by robbing squirrels' hoards. Where squirrels are abundant in the forest, the last method is the cheapest. Climbing trees is practiced only where the trees are small. When this method is employed, the workmen should be equipped with linemen's belts and climbers. Picking from felled trees is readily carried on except where dense underbrush interferes, as is the case in the ordinary Douglas fir forest. Trees growing in the open, with large crowns extending down the greater part of the bole, bear cones more abundantly than trees in dense forests, and for this reason collecting from scattered open growths can be done more cheaply than on logging areas. Often large quantities of cones can be purchased from settlers who will collect and deliver them at central points at a stipulated price. When this method is employed, however, frequent examination of the cones should be made to ascertain that they will contain the full number of seed, for often opened cones from which a part or all of the seed has been disseminated will be offered for sale. Insect larvae also often destroy a large proportion of the seed, particularly when the crop is light, and care should be taken that the cones purchased are not infested. Prices paid for cones vary from 25 cents to 50 cents per sack for the larger cones, like yellow and white pine, and 50 cents to $1 for Douglas fir and spruce, depending upon the abundance of the crop. After the cones are gathered, the seed must be extracted and cleaned. Where climatic conditions in the fall of the year will permit air drying, the cones may be spread out on sheets or blankets where they will be exposed to the sun and wind. Under this treatment they will open in from 3 to 6 days, depending upon the weather and the species. Where bad weather will interfere with air drying, the cones must be dried under cover by artificial heat. This is the method usually employed by professional seed collectors, and where large quantities of cones are to be treated each year, special dry houses are constructed and fitted with elaborate drying apparatus. The work can be done most cheaply with such an establishment, but for the ordinary timber owner who expects to collect seed only occasionally, a makeshift dry house which will answer the purpose can be fitted up inexpensively in any unused building. The essential features are shelves or trays 4 feet wide arranged around the walls of the room, one above the other and separated about 8 inches apart, and a heating stove placed in the center of the room. The shelves may be made of burlap stretched tight, or, better still, of wire screening of 1 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch mesh. After being subjected to a temperature not exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit for from 24 to 48 hours, the cones will open, allowing the seed to fall out when shaken or pounded. The seed, when separated from the cones, is then mixed with a coarse gravel in about the proportion of 4 to 1 and churned to remove the wings. Finally, all foreign matter is removed by screening and hollow seed blown out by passing it through an ordinary fanning mill. Seeding versus planting. The selection of the method of reforestation to employ, whether direct seeding or planting, depends primarily upon the character of the area to be restocked. Direct seeding is usually considerably cheaper when the results are satisfactory, but only on the more favorable sites where moisture and soil conditions are right is there any assurance of success. Even in such cases, partial or total destruction of the seed often results from birds and rodents. In exposed situations where the soil is shallow, or where, because of climatic conditions, soil dries out several inches deep during the growing season, the seed may not germinate at all, or the young seedlings may be killed before they have time to send their roots down to the permanent moisture level. In such situations, planting is the only reliable method. If the plant material is of the proper kind and the work well done, satisfactory results are almost certain to follow. Direct seeding is a much more rapid method than planting, and where extensive areas are to be restocked within a short period and seed is abundant, the work can be completed quickly. On the other hand, this method is wasteful of seed because a large proportion fails to germinate, and the young seedlings often succumb to adverse conditions, so that where seed is scarce or its cost high, planting is the more practical method. Because planting is the most reliable method, it has been the one most largely employed in extensive operations, both here and in most European counties. But thorough tests are now being made of direct seeding, and under proper conditions, it promises to be fairly satisfactory. The Douglas fir region west of the Cascade Mountains offers the most favorable conditions for direct seeding, and except on badly exposed south slopes, or where the growth of brush is exceedingly dense, it is believed this method will prove a satisfactory one for the timber owner to employ. In the yellow pine regions, conditions are not so satisfactory for direct seeding, since this tree occurs largely in a region of deficient rainfall. However, natural reproduction is abundant throughout many portions of this type, and it is probable that direct seeding will prove fairly successful if the proper methods are employed and if forest conditions have not been too greatly disturbed. That some method of successfully employing direct seeding with yellow pine be found is greatly to be desired, since yellow pine seedlings do not withstand transplanting well, but there is need for careful experimentation before extensive seeding operations in this type by private timber owners would be justifiable. Western white pine, it is believed, will be easy to reproduce in most of its native situations by direct seeding, though the greater scarcity of its seed and the fact that it will be more subject to destruction by birds and rodents because of its larger size may make planting the more practical method. Trees for planting can either be purchased from commercial nurserymen or grown in nurseries established for that purpose near the planting site. When only a few thousand trees are needed, it is cheaper to purchase them. But when extensive operations are contemplated, covering hundreds of acres in which millions of trees will be needed, it is far preferable for the owner to grow the trees in his own nursery. Some initial outlay for the establishment of the nursery will be necessary, and a practical nurseryman should be employed, but the saving in the cost of the trees will fully compensate for these. 1-, 2-, and 3-year-old trees, the latter, once transplanted, are usually employed in planting, the older trees being used for the less favorable sites. In planting, they are placed in rows equidistant apart, the spacing varying from 4 to 12 feet, with a general average of about 6 feet. The work may be done either in the fall after growth has ceased, or in the spring before growth commences. The cost of planting, of course, will vary greatly with the age of the trees, the number planted per acre, and the accessibility and character of the planting site. With young trees and wide spacing, the cost may be as low as $6 per acre, while in more unfavorable situations where older plants are used and planting is more laborious, it may be as high as $16. A fair average, however, for those areas which a timber owner would be most likely to plant up is about $8 to $10 per acre. Indirect seeding, several methods may be employed, such as broadcasting over the entire area with or without previous preparation of the soil, sowing in strips, or sowing in seed spots. But observation and experiment have shown that it is necessary for seeds such as Douglas fir, yellow pine, and western white pine to come in close contact with the mineral soil in order that it may germinate and the seedlings live. Consequently, only those methods should be used which will accomplish this. Where the area has been burned over previous to sowing and the mineral soil laid bare, broadcast seeding may be employed. Where the ground will permit the use of a harrow, good results are obtainable by scarifying the soil in strips about 10 feet apart and sowing the seed in these strips. On unburned areas covered with a dense growth of fern, salal, moss, grass, or other plants, this covering must be removed by the seed spot method. This consists in removing the ground cover with a grub hoe or mattock in spots of varying diameter, 6 inches to 3 feet, and of various distances apart, 6 to 15 feet, and sowing the seed in these spots. The advantages of this method are that a minimum amount of seed is used, the ground can be prepared and the seed covered to what extent is desirable, and the soil pressed down. This method is believed to be the one best suited to the greatest variety of sites. The amount of seed used per acre will, of course, vary with the species and the method used, and the quality of the seed. The following table indicates the approximate quantity of seed of good average quality required per acre for 3 different methods, the average cost when collected in fairly large quantities, and the number of seed per pound. Species: Douglas fir. Number of seed per pound: 42,000. Cost per pound: $1.50. Number of pounds required per acre, broadcast, entire area: 2 to 3. Strips: 1/2 to 1. Seed spots: 6 feet apart, 1/2 to 3/4. Yellow pine. Number of seeds per pound: 8,000. Cost per pound: 50 cents. Number of pounds required per acre, broadcast, entire area: 10 to 12. Strips: 2 to 2.5. Seed spots: 6 feet apart, 1.5 to 2. Western white pine. Number of seeds per pound: 14,000. Cost per pound: 75 cents. Number of pounds required per acre, broadcast, entire area: 6 to 8. Strips: 1.5 to 1 3/4. Seed spots: 6 feet apart, 1 to 1.5. The total cost, too, will vary widely, not only because of the different quantities of seed used, but also because of the great extent to which the methods are varied to suit the conditions occurring upon the area. Simple broadcasting without any preparation or treatment of the soil will not exceed 20 cents to 25 cents per acre for labor. Harrowing and sowing in strips, 85 cents to $1.10 per acre, and sowing in seed spots, $2 to $5 per acre. Upon this basis, the total cost per acre will approximate the figures given in the table below. Douglas fir, broadcast over entire area, $3.20 to $4.75. Strips, $1 to $2.60. Seed spots, 6 feet apart, $2.75 to $6. Yellow pine, broadcast over entire area, $5.20 to $6.25. Strips, $1.85 to $2.35. Seed spots, 6 feet apart, $2.75 to $6. Western white pine, broadcast over entire area, $4.70 to $6.25. Strips, $2 to $2.40. Seed spots 6 feet apart, $2.75 to $6. Rate of growth and probable returns. Of all factors in calculating the financial possibilities of second forest crops, the growth to be expected is the easiest to determine with fair accuracy. Future stumpage value, tax burden, and fire risk are all subject to uncertain influences, but the approximate yield of a given species under given natural conditions will be the same in the future that it is now. To predict it requires only study of existing stands without being misled by the influence of conditions which will not be repeated. On the other hand, an immense amount of misinformation is circulated because of superficial observation. Enthusiasts discovering individual trees which have made prodigious growth, or even fairly extensive stands on fertile soil with heavy rainfall, will compute saw log yields at 40 or 50 years, which are much too optimistic for general application. Others, remembering some stand they have seen in unfavorable localities, or noting shade-suppressed trees which will not be paralleled after the virgin forest is removed, are unduly discouraged. It is most essential that yield tables be made by trained observers who know how to reach the true average, and that the figures either actually come from the region to which they are to be applied, or are accompanied by a systematic analysis of climatic and other conditions which permits intelligent comparison. In calculating another yield on cut-over land, the system for an even-aged new growth, such as will follow clean cutting of Douglas fir for example, is quite different from that necessary if the cutting amounts only to selection of the merchantable trees, and leaves a fair stand of smaller ones. In the latter case, yield tables based on average acreage production are of little use, because so much depends upon the character of the stand which remains on the tract in question. Here the basis must be the rate of growth of the average individual tree. An estimate by the number in each present diameter class may be made of the trees which will escape logging, showing, let us say for example, about 5 trees of each diameter from 6 to 12 inches, or 35 in all which are over 6 inches. If the growth study indicates that in 20 years there will have been added 6 inches in diameter, we can estimate a crop of 5 trees each of classes extending from 12 to 18 inches. Actually, the process will not be so simple, for the different aged trees will not grow with equal rapidity, and several other factors must be reckoned with, but the general principle is to apply rate of growth knowledge to the material on hand, and study of this material is essential. For predicting even-aged crops resulting from entire restocking, the acquisition of necessary basic information is as difficult, or more so, but its application is far simpler. That the ground will be fully stocked by natural or artificial means must be assumed, but we can also assume that the result will be influenced only by normal locality conditions and not by accidental condition of the present forest. Therefore we use a yield table and not a growth table. This can be made by actual measurement of existing second growth stands of different ages, which proves not only the growth rate, but also the number of trees which the natural shade thinning process results in at different periods of the forest life. The chief danger of inaccuracy in such information lies in basing it on insufficient measurements or in applying it where soil or moisture conditions are greatly different. The latter error can be guarded against, however, by use of growth figures taken in conjunction with it. For example, if a yield table showing 25,000 feet to the acre at 50 years from seed is accompanied by one showing that the average stand it represents is 125 high at 50 years, and its average 50-year tree is 14 inches in diameter, little investigation is necessary to determine whether in any given locality the growth falls far above or below that. An attempt to reproduce here any considerable number of growth and yield tables would be of doubtful use without more space than is allowed to explain how they are made and used. There are many technicalities, both mathematical and silvicultural, and unfortunately most of the available figures for the Northwest, obtained by the Forest Service, have not been generalized enough for wide popular value. This is particularly true of yield tables which necessarily require assuming standards of merchantability. While the best western white pine table assumes that by the time a new crop is cut 7-inch white pine will be sellable, The best fir table was worked upon a 12-inch diameter basis. Obviously, this would show an unfairly greater yield of a pine forest containing trees between 7 and 12 inches, and be very misleading in calculating financial results at the same age and stumpage rates. Yet without the original data, there is no way of reducing both tables to the same basis. As an example, however, to indicate how the financial possibilities of second growth can be arrived at if a systematic study is made, let us take the Douglas fir figures referred to. Douglas fir. These are exceedingly reliable. Measurements were taken by the Forest Service of practically pure fir on about 400 areas in 35 different age stands from 10 to 140 years old, ranging along the western Cascade foothills from the Canadian line to central Oregon. Since reforestation investment is likely to be confined mainly to the more promising opportunities, only such growth was measured as gave an average representation of the better class of the two, should all the general territory covered be graded in two quality classes of all around ability to produce forests. On the other hand, care was taken not to represent the maximum of the better class, data being taken only from permanent forest land and not from rich potential agricultural land which might show unfairly rapid forest growth. The average diameters were actually measured and the number, age, form, diameter growth, height growth, board foot contents, etc. of all the trees on them were accurately determined. Trees 12 inches in diameter, 4 1/2 feet from the ground were considered merchantable, and it was assumed they could be used to 8 inches in the top. From this data were prepared tables and diagrams showing the average development of trees and stands under fairly favorable conditions in the region west of the Cascades. This gave the following yield per acre. Age of stand 40 years. Feet board material 12,400. Age 50 years. Feet 28,000. Age 60 years. Feet 41,000. Age 70 years. Feet 51,700. Age 80 years. Feet 61,100. Age 90 years. Feet 70,200. Age 100. Feet 79,800. Age 110. Feet 90,300. Age 120. Feet 101,500. Age 130 years. Feet 113,000. Let us see how these figures can be used in answering the primary question of the prospective timber grower. Will it pay to hold my cut-over land for a second crop? Obviously, no certain answer can be printed here, not only because no uniform stumpage prices or carrying charges can be predicted, but also because individuals may differ as to what profit is necessary to make the investment pay. So it will be necessary to analyze the situation so each may select the premises which suit his own case and judgment. The investment made by the holder of cut-over land is of two kinds: that represented by the land which otherwise he might sell, putting the proceeds at work in some other business, and the annual carrying charges which otherwise he might also invest differently. The sum attainable by investing the money available by sale after logging, adding to it yearly the sum required for fire prevention and taxes, and compounding both at a satisfactory interest for the entire period, is practically the cost of holding the tract for any given number of years. By calculating this cost upon a basis of 1 acre and dividing it by the yield board measure which the same period will produce, the cost per 1,000 feet of growing a second crop is arrived at. Against this may be set the gross return from the same expected yield at any given stumpage rate. The yield at the end of the 50-year investment will not be that of a 50-year forest, however, for although the carrying cost begins at once, the new forest requires a few years to become established. No exact figure can be set for this, for some seed will sprout the first year and some blank spaces may persist several years, but in the tables to follow 5 years has been allowed for an average. Consequently, instead of calculating on a 28m yield as the return at the end of 50 years, as indicated in the yield table on the preceding page, the 45-year yield of 20 1/2m is used, and similarly for the other periods of 60, 70, and 80 years. These 4 rotations only will be considered here, for in less than 50 years second growth will probably be too small to be cut at the highest profit, while after 80 years the investment compounds so heavily as to make it improbable that increasing stumpage values will compensate. 3 interest rates have been used in the first table to follow: 4, 5, and 6% compound. Forced calculations at lower rates are often seen, but it is not believed that less than 5% will be satisfactory to private owners, and many will insist on 6%. The fair standard is what the owner can make in other business today, and since he can reinvest his income in the same business, it is reasonable to figure at a compound rate. A few examples are given to show how similar calculations may be made with any set of investment and stumpage factors which appeal to individual judgment. The second table, prepared from the first, shows at a glance the price that must be received for Douglas fir to make it pay either 5 or 6% compound interest under a range of 60 different conditions of the original investment and annual cost. End of section 6. Section 7 of Practical Forestry in the Pacific Northwest by Edward Tyson Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Forestry in the Forest, Part 4. It should be borne in mind that, although present land value is made a charge, the value of the land at the time of harvest is not considered. This value is certain to increase greatly in the long periods involved. Taxation charges will be against it as well as against the timber. Indeed, much land is now held without any regard to possible second growth. It should be assumed, therefore, that any profit in forest investment shown will be increased by the sum obtainable for the land at the end of the same period. Cost per m of growing Douglas fir resulting for every $1 per acre originally invested. At the end of 50 years, at 4%, 35 cents. At 5%, 56 cents. At 6%, 90 cents. At the end of 60 years, at 4%, 30 cents, at 5%, 53 cents, at 6%, 94 cents. At the end of 70 years, at 4%, 33 cents, at 5%, 65 cents, at 6%, $1.27. At the end of 80 years, at 4%, 41 cents, at 5%, 88 cents, at 6%, $1.87. Cost per m of growing Douglas fir resulting from every 1 cent per acre of annual carrying charge. At the end of 50 years, at 4%, 7.4 cents. At 5%, 10.2 cents. At 6%, 14.2 cents. At the end of 60 years, at 4%, 6.8 cents. At 5%, 10.1 cents. At 6%, 15.2 cents. At the end of 70 years, at 4%, 7.8 cents. At 5%, 12.6 cents. At 6%, 20.8 cents. At the end of 80 years, at 4%, 9.8 cents. At 5%, 17.2 cents. At 6%, 30.9 cents. Example 1. With land worth $2.50 an acre at present, and an estimated carrying charge of 3 cents a year for protection and 20 cents per taxes, what stumpage price for a 50-year crop will pay 5% compound interest? 6%? 5%. 2.5 times 56 cents equals $1.40. 23 times 10.2 cents equals $2.35. Summed, $3.75. 6%. 2.5 times 90 cents equals $2.25. 23 times 14.2 cents equals $3.27. Summed, $5.52. Example 2. With land worth $5 an acre at present and stumpage estimated to reach $7 in 60 years, what is the maximum annual carrying charge per acre which can be paid during this period and permit a 5% return? A 6% return? 5%, gross return equals $7. 5 times 53 cents equals $2.65. $7 minus $2.65 equals $4.35 divided by 10.1 cents equals 43 cents. 6%, gross return equals $7. 5 times 94 cents equals $4.70. $7 minus $4.70 equals $2.30, divided by 15.2 cents equals 15 cents. Example 3. Assuming that stumpage will be worth $6 in 50 years, and that public enlightenment will keep the annual fire and tax charge from exceeding 20 cents, what price obtainable for cut-over land today, made to earn 5% compound interest in some other business, is as profitable as keeping the land for a second crop? If other businesses would earn 6%, 5%, gross return equals $6. 20 times 10.2 cents equals $2.04. $6 minus $2.04 equals $3.06, divided by 56 cents equals $7.07. 6%. Gross return $6. 20 times 14.2 cents equals $2.84. $6 minus $2.84 equals $3.16. Divided by 90 cents equals $3.51. Future stumpage prices necessary to make Douglas fir second crop pay either 5 or 6% compound interest on investment. Maximum original investment $7.50 an acre. Maximum annual carrying charge 30 cents an acre. For 5% compound interest, an original investment per acre of $2.50, taxes and protection paid yearly per acre of 10 cents, cost per m feet in a 50-year rotation 20.5 m per A, $2.40, 60-year rotation 35 m per A, $2.35, 70-year rotation 46.6 m per A, $2.90, 80-year rotation 56.5 m per A, $3.90. Original investment per acre of $2.50 with taxes and protection paid yearly per acre of 15 cents. Cost per m feet for 50-year rotation $2.95. 60-year rotation $2.85. 70-year rotation $3.50. 80-year rotation $4.80. Original investment of $2.50, taxes and protection paid yearly of 20 cents, cost per m feet in a 50-year rotation $3.45, 60-year rotation $3.35, 70-year rotation $4.15, 80-year rotation $5.65. Original investment per acre of $2.50, taxes and protection paid yearly per acre of 25 cents, cost per m feet 50-year rotation $3.95, 60-year rotation $3.85, 70-year rotation $4.75, 80-year rotation $6.50. Original investment per acre of $2.50, taxes and protection paid yearly per acre of 30 cents, cost per m feet 50-year rotation $4.45, 60-year rotation $4.35, 70-year rotation $5.40, 80-year rotation $7.35. 5% compound interest, original investment per acre $5, taxes and protection paid yearly per acre 10 cents, cost per m feet 50-year rotation $3.80, 60-year rotation $3.65, 70-year rotation $4.50, 80-year rotation $6.10. Original investment per acre of $5, taxes and protection paid yearly per acre of 15 cents, cost per m feet 50-year rotation $4.35, 60-year rotation $4.20, 70-year rotation $5.15, 80-year rotation $6.95. Original investment per acre of $5, taxes and protection paid yearly per acre of 20 cents, cost per m feet 50-year rotation $4.85. 60-year rotation, $4.70. 70-year rotation, $5.75. 80-year rotation, $7.80. Original investment per acre of $5. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre of 25 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $5.35. 60-year rotation, $5.20. 70-year rotation, $6.40. 80-year rotation, $8.70. Original investment per acre of $5. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre of 30 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $5.85. 60-year rotation, $5.70. 70-year rotation, $7.05. 80-year rotation, $9.55. 5% compound interest. Original investment per acre, $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 10 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $5.20. 60-year rotation, $5. 70-year rotation, $6.15. 80-year rotation, $8.30. Original investment per acre, $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 15 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $5.75. 60-year rotation, $5.50. 70-year rotation, $6.75. 80-year rotation, $9.20. Original investment per acre, $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 20 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $6.25. 60-year rotation, $6. 70-year rotation, $7.40. 80-year rotation, $10.05. Original investment per acre of $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 25 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $6.75. 60-year rotation, $6.50. 70-year rotation, $8. 80-year rotation, $10. Original investment per acre of $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 30 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $7.25. 60-year rotation, $7. 70-year rotation, $8.65. 80-year rotation, $11.75. 6% compound interest. Original investment per acre, $2.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 10 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $3.65. 60-year rotation, $3.85. 70-year rotation, $5.25. 80-year rotation, $7.75. Original investment per acre, $2.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 15 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $4.40. 60-year rotation, $4.65. 70-year rotation, $6.30. 80-year rotation, $9.30. Original investment per acre, $2.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 20 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $5.10. 60-year rotation, $5.40. 70-year rotation, $7.35. 80-year rotation, $10.85. Original investment per acre, $2.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 25 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $5.80. 60-year rotation, $6.15. 70-year rotation, $8.35. 80-year rotation, $12.35. Original investment per acre, $2.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 30 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $6.50. 60-year rotation, $6.90. 70-year rotation, $9.40. 80-year rotation, $13.90. Original investment per acre, $5. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 10 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $5.90. 60-year rotation, $6.20. 70-year rotation, $8.45. 80-year rotation, $12.45. Original investment per acre, $5. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 15 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $6.65. 60-year rotation, $7.80. 70-year rotation, $9.45. 80-year rotation, $14. Original investment per acre, $5. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 20 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $7.35. 60-year rotation, $7.75. 70-year rotation, $10.50. 80-year rotation, $15.50. Original investment per acre, $5. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 25 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $8.05. 60-year rotation, $8.50. 70-year rotation, $11.55. 80-year rotation, $17.05. Original investment per acre, $5. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 30 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $8.75. 60-year rotation, $9.25. 70-year rotation, $12.60. 80-year rotation, $18.60. Original investment per acre, $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 10 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $8.15. 60-year rotation, $8.55. 70-year rotation, $11.60. 80-year rotation, $17.10. Original investment per acre, $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 15 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $8.90. 60-year rotation, $9.35. 70-year rotation, $12.65. 80-year rotation, $18.65. Original investment per acre, $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 20 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $9.60. 60-year rotation, $10.10. 70-year rotation, $13.70. 80-year rotation, $20.20. Original investment per acre, $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 25 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $10.30. 60-year rotation, $10.85. 70-year rotation, $14.70. 80-year rotation, $21.75. Original investment per acre, $7.50. Taxes and protection paid yearly per acre, 30 cents. Cost per m feet, 50-year rotation, $11. 60-year rotation, $11.60. 70-year rotation, $15.75. 80-year rotation, $23.30. These tables bring out a number of very interesting primary facts. 1. The rate of interest demanded of the investment is one of the most important factors. This is because such long terms are involved. The charges compound with prodigious rapidity toward the last. In any other business paying 6% compound, the maximum investment per acre given in the preceding table, that of a land value of $7.50 and a 30-cent annual charge for 80 years, would earn $1,317. A 75-year forest then harvestable should have 56 1/2 m to the acre, but this would have to bring over $25 per M to pay as well. On the other hand, the same deposits earning 4% would only amount to $338 in the same period, which would be equaled by timber at $6 per M. 2. For similar reasons, the length of time before cutting has much to do with profit or loss. The compounding of carrying charges eventually outstrips the production of material to a degree which can be offset only by the most rapid rise of stumpage values. 3. The greater the investment, the more marked the above effect, and consequently the tendency to market an inferior product. A 60-year rotation is indicated by a majority of the conditions shown. 4. A comparatively slight increase in annual tax or fire charges may make the difference between profit and loss. Roughly, stumpage must bring $1 per M more to compensate for each 10 cents an acre for taxes at 5% or for 7 cents at 6%. 5. If the land is sellable for $5 an acre or more, it cannot be made to pay 6% compound interest under the most favorable conditions, unless the stumpage received exceeds $6. At $5 stumpage and with reasonable taxation, it will pay 5% if it escapes fire. 6. 30 cents an acre is apparently about the maximum annual carrying charge which will permit a 6% profit, even with very high stumpage prices. Consequently, while present taxes on cut-over land are seldom prohibitive, there must be reasonable certainty that excessive increase will not occur. The carrying charges shown in the second table cover both fire protection and taxes, as by reading the 15-cent line to include a 10-cent tax and a 5-cent fire patrol. The investment charge may be used to represent sale value only, or sale value plus any expense incurred at time of logging, in order to secure reproduction, such as leaving saleable material in seed trees or planting. If desired, any owner may make a similar calculation on any other valuation, better fitting his own situation. The table is not intended for universal use, but merely as an illustration of how forest calculations may be made. White pine. Too much space would be required to give a similar table for all western species, even were as good yield figures available. Roughly speaking, however, western white pine, under conditions thoroughly favorable to it, may be expected to make as good a yield as Douglas fir, and the above fir table will not be far off for it. A probably higher stumpage value should offset any lesser production. Hemlock. Western hemlock is of somewhat but not much slower growth when coming in on open land as an even-aged stand. No yield table based on the same merchantable standards as the fir table quoted has been prepared, but the following is fairly safe to include all trees 14 inches in diameter, used to 12 inches in the top. At 50 years, 2 m per acre. At 60 years, 22 m. At 70 years, 33 m. At 80 years, 40 m. The absence of a 40-year figure and the sudden jump between 50 and 60 years is because very few hemlock trees reach 14 inches at 50 years, but a large number of 12 and 13-inch trees pass into that class during the 10 years following. Any yield figures for an even-aged forest show a similar jump at the point where the stand as a whole reaches the determined minimum merchantable size. For the same reason, these hemlock figures are not very far less promising than those given for fir, for at corresponding ages the latter include 12 and 13-inch trees, and all trees are considered merchantable to a top diameter of 8 inches. Spruce. Since no systematic study of Sitka spruce second growth has been made, it can only be predicted from knowledge of its habits that while in favorable situation it will yield as heavily as Douglas fir, in other localities its growth in early life is slower and less regular, making it less likely to produce a good crop before the carrying charges become burdensome. If this proves true, taxation rates and land values will be extremely important factors, offset to some degree by a smaller fire hazard and the probability of high stumpage. Redwood. For redwood we also lack good figures for any considerable range of conditions and ages, for redwood growth which followed burns does not exist, and there are no very old cuttings. Government studies on the northern California coast prove conclusively, however, that this is our most rapid growing native commercial tree. In 30 years, in fair soil, it will produce a tree of 16 inches in diameter, 80 feet high, and some existing 45-year stands run 20 to 30 inches on the stump and about 100 feet high. Reckoning 14-inch trees as merchantable to be used to 10 inches in the tops, a 25 to 30 year second growth after logging near Crescent City was found to have 2½ feet to the acre, and the future increase should be very rapid. There is little question of the profit of growing redwood, provided the difficulties described elsewhere of getting a dense crop started are overcome. Profitable thinnings. In addition to the yield of saw timber to be expected when the second crop reaches manufacturing size, there will be a market in many cases for material obtained by thinning. It is perfectly fair to compound for the remainder of the rotation any net profit so obtained and to set it against the carrying charges. In many cases it will go far to turn an apparently losing investment into a very profitable one. Moreover, the proper thinning of growing stands not only utilizes material which would otherwise die and be lost before the main harvest, but actually improves the quality of the first yield. In obtaining the figures previously quoted, the Forest Service found that the average Douglas fir stand at 40 years contains 410 living trees, most of them between 6 and 15 inches in diameter. At 60 years there are but 265 trees, 145 having died and decayed in the 20-year interval, which were suitable for ties and other small timber products. The remaining trees would have been improved by thinning to prevent this loss, for the greatest diameter growth is made when the stand is open, and the ideal is to have just the density which will get the greatest wood production and still result in proper pruning and clearing of the trees. Commenting along this line, Mr. T. Munger, who conducted the investigation, says: that thinnings are silviculturally practicable and financially profitable in the Pacific Northwest has been demonstrated. In the vicinity of Cottage Grove, Oregon, many fully stocked, even aged Douglas fir stands, now about 50 years old, most of them forming a part of ranches. Many of these stands have been cut over in the last 10 years and all the material then large enough for piling or mine timber cut out. This removed about 20% of the stand. At the present time, many of these same stands now contain much material valuable for small piles, ties, and mine timber, yet the crown canopy is as dense and the trees as close and fine quality as though no cutting had ever been done in the stand. In fact, some of the 50-year-old stands have already been cut over a second time, and each time with decided profit to the owner and no damage to the forest. From one 10-acre block of second growth now 50 years old, situated 7 miles from the railroad, already 32,000 feet of mining timber and about 150-foot piles have been taken out, yet the stand is now in good condition, and in a few years more of the smaller trees can be removed without infringing on the yield of the final crop. The material from these thinnings was worth at the railroad about $80 per acre. Conclusions. Throughout the preceding pages on the financial promise of timber growing in the West, the attempt has been not to give conclusions, but to state certain known facts regarding tree growth and indicate how these may be used in arriving at conclusions based largely upon the conditions and judgment of the individual owner. In many cases they will do little more than suggest further investigation necessary. The Western Forestry and Conservation Association, and doubtless the district foresters for the Forest Service, will be glad to discuss such work and assist if possible. There are, however, several conservative deductions to be made. 1. The Pacific Coast states contain large areas having species and climatic conditions peculiarly favorable for forest growing as a business. The rapidity and quantity of yield ensure profit under conditions which would be prohibitive elsewhere. 2. In many cases, perhaps in most, a second crop can be started with little initial expense. 3. There is much land of no value for any other purpose. 4. Even if the owner does not care to hold his land long enough for another crop, or if he is prevented from doing so at some future time by excessive taxation or other prohibition, its disposal value will be greater if it bears young forest growth than if it does not. 5. Stumpage values are certain to advance greatly, and their advance will be governed largely by these factors: a. Speculative influence necessarily accompanying the lessening of the nation's and world's timber supply. b. The carrying charges of fire prevention and taxation imposed by the community upon virgin timber, which, since they represent an investment which must be recouped, will either be added in the long run to the price of stumpage exactly in the measure of their severity and so transferred to the consumer, or result in rapid cutting and consequently raise the speculative value of that which escapes cutting. This the consumer will pay also. c. The quantity of new timber grown. 6. It is probable that future demand for timber will reimburse the cost of growing it, be this cost high or low within reasonable limits. 7. This does not mean, however, that the timberland owner will or can generally engage in the business when the cost is excessive. While he could probably make a good profit eventually, such an investment is too heavy and prolonged to be inviting. Besides, there is the possibility of entire loss by fire. He will naturally compare it with other investments having less disadvantages. For example, since conditions which discourage the growing of new competing forests tend for this very reason to enhance the value of existing forests, he might invest further in the latter instead, with equal ultimate profit and with easier access to his money at any time. 8. Consequently, the growing of timber is promising to the private owner only when the investment can be borne easily. Since it has three forms, land value, fire protection, and taxation, all must be moderate or, if one or more is high, the rest must be low. 9. With the fire hazard great at present, and taxation so uncertain as to require allowing for its being excessive, the initial investment must be insignificant. 10. This confines it to land of low sale value and precludes much expense to ensure the second crop. 11. To secure the perpetuation of forests on the scale essential to public welfare, the public must provide the private owner better fire protection and an equitable taxation system. Or else it must purchase sufficient cut-over land and engage in forestry itself, bearing the cost and taking the risk. 12. Nevertheless, there are several practical exceptions to the somewhat unfavorable situation theoretically outlined above. A. Many owners are warranted in holding cut-over land for some time, if not indefinitely, because of the upward trend of land values generally. Unless clearly most useful for agriculture, such land will be made more valuable by a growth of young timber. However indefinite the profit of encouraging this growth and protecting it from fire may be, if the present sale value and taxes are computed against such outlay, the two latter charges are being carried anyway and are the most important ones. Merely that it cannot be proved that they can be more than offset is no reason for not trying to compensate as far as possible at slight further expense. While this may not often permit any great effort to reforest, it will usually warrant protection of the natural new growth that will follow if given a chance. B. Many owners would prefer to have their milling business continue indefinitely. If such have or can purchase virgin timber to carry them 50 years or more, they may do well to grow a log supply to come into use at that time, even if they would not do so merely as a stumpage investment. C. It is highly probable that history will repeat itself in the United States, especially in the Pacific Coast states, where every other condition is so favorable to making forestry a great benefit to the community, and that fire and tax discouragements will be removed as soon as the public realizes the situation. The owner who anticipates this and gets his crop started first will be the first to profit from it, and since it is the compounding toward the latter end of the rotation which now appears serious, the chances are that he will not have a heavy burden before relief of this kind arrives. D. Every owner of virgin timber which he expects to hold uncut for 10 years or more should consider reforestation of adjacent cut-over land in the light of fire protection also. It is the inflammable, sun-dried, brake-covered openings, yearly increasing in extent, which constitute his greatest fire menace. The conversion of these into green young growth, too dense for fern and salal, and destructible only by the hottest crown fires, is the best protection he can give mature timber surrounded by them. Some additional expense for a few years to accomplish this will usually be cheaper and safer than the patrol otherwise required for an indefinite period. E. Advance in the value of the land itself, realizable when the second crop is cut, will in many cases be great enough to make an otherwise unpromising reforestation investment profitable. Hardwood Experiments. In the foregoing pages, consideration has been given to the growing of native coniferous species only. There is a field, however, yet to be entered into by the timber grower in the Pacific Northwest, which gives promise of good returns. This is the growing of eastern hardwoods. As is well known, the supply of native hardwoods in this region is deficient, and those occurring are of poor quality. The demand for stable hardwoods is constant, and at present can be filled only through importation from the East. Moreover, the manufacturing industry in the Pacific Northwest is as yet only in its infancy, and as this industry becomes of greater importance in the future, the demand for hardwood lumber is bound to increase. This increase in demand, coupled with a rapidly diminishing supply in the east, seem certain to create a condition under which it will be profitable to grow hardwoods commercially. That eastern species will thrive under forest conditions in this region has not, of course, been demonstrated, but the great variety of species planted successfully as shade trees in towns and cities, and in many instances by settlers in the mountains and farming districts, together with the marked success of various fruits introduced here, would tend to indicate their adaptability to the climate. In many respects, the climate along the coast of Oregon and Washington is similar to that found throughout the great hardwood region of the southern Appalachian Mountains. Of the many species occurring in the East, several appear preeminently suited to experimentation because of their particular value in the trade and rapid growth. Hickory is one of the most valuable of eastern woods, and the supply remaining is probably least of all the important species. It is largely used in the vehicle industry, and because of the fact that the trade can use trees of small size, and even prefers second growth hickory to the more mature form, a crop can be grown within a comparatively short time. Shagbark or pignut are probably the best species to plant. Red oak is another species for which there is a large demand, and while it does not equal the white oak in value, its more rapid growth makes it a more desirable species to grow. The increasing scarcity of white oak has brought about the substitution of red oak for many purposes for which the more superior variety was formerly used exclusively. Black walnut is a wood highly prized in furniture manufacture, and this, coupled with its rapid growth, places it among the first rank of hardwood trees. Chestnut, white ash, tulip, poplar, and black cherry are other species whose values for various purposes suggest the possible advisability of their introduction. Much that has been said in the chapter concerning the methods of establishing coniferous woods applies equally well to hardwoods. Those species, however, whose seeds are in the form of nuts, such as hickories, black walnut, chestnuts, and oaks, are particularly adapted to propagation by direct seeding. Other species, such as ash, tulip, poplar, and black cherry, whose seeds are small, are better grown for 1 year in nurseries before transplanting into the field. Where plantations are started by planting the nuts directly in the field, the cost will be moderate. The nuts can be obtained in any quantity from eastern seed dealers, and their cost together with the labor of planting them should not exceed $4 per acre. Where the area planted is level and free from underbrush, preliminary plowing and harrowing, while adding $1.50 to $2 to the cost per acre, will add much to the success of the plantation. Cultivation during the early years of the life of the trees will also result in increased growth. End of section 7. Section 8 of Practical Forestry in the Pacific Northwest by Edward Tyson Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Forestry and the Fire Hazard. The Slashing Menace. The function of fire as an aid to reproduction of the forest in some instances has been discussed in a preceding chapter. The protection question is of even greater importance, for whether we consider mature timber or reforestation, no forest management is worth while if the investment is to burn up. It can be divided broadly under two heads: reduction of risk due to operative methods, and general protection. Whichever we consider, the interest of every lumberman is at stake. The fire question affects him in many ways beside the danger of direct loss. The sale value of timber in any region is increased by knowledge that progressive protective methods prevail among those operating there. Nothing more effectively removes public carelessness with fire, or lack of helpful sympathy with the lumber industry in general, than evidence that the lumberman himself is devoting every effort to safeguarding instead of wasting this great public resource. Of operative methods reducing fire risk, one of the most important is disposal of logging debris. The deliberate accumulation of immensely inflammable material, almost always where extremely likely to be ignited, is a form of actually inviting disaster practiced by no property holders except lumbermen. Nowhere is it carried to such an extreme as in the West, where the refuse left on the ground is of so great volume as to preclude human control if it is once fired at a dry time, and where accidental fire is more often of a certainty than a liability. Of late, however, the more progressive lumbermen of the fir region have adopted the practice of firing their slashings annually at a time when the surrounding woods will not burn, and the pine men of Idaho and Montana have quite widely endorsed brush piling. Idaho has a piling law. Oregon already has a slash burning law which is partially observed. The greatest objection to such a law is that neither reforestation nor economical protection indicates the same practice in different types of forest, and it is extremely difficult to make the law both flexible and effective. More will be accomplished by voluntary adoption of the method best suited to each condition. Brush piling. In the more open pine stands of the interior, where both logging debris and original combustible ground cover are small, slashings threaten the adjacent timber less than in denser forests, but are of peculiar danger to the valuable young growth usually left on the area itself. As we have seen in a previous chapter on western yellow pine, reproduction in dry localities may require scattering the brush over the ground and keeping fire out, and there may be abnormally dense stands suggesting clean slash burning, but as a rule brush piling is the best course. In view of the importance of this subject, the following extracts are taken from a circular issued by the Forest Service. Advantages of brush burning. The greatest advantage of brush burning is the protection it gives against fire. In many cases, brush burning is the only practicable safeguard against fire. After the average lumbering operation, the ground is covered with slash, scattered about or piled just as the swampers have left it. This, in the dry season, is a veritable fire trap. Probably 90% of all uncontrolled cuttings are burnt over, which retards the second crop at least from 50 to 100 years and perhaps permanently changes the composition of the forest. Fires may be set by loggers while still at work on the area, or several years after by lightning, campers, or locomotives. By piling the brush and burning it in wet weather or in snow, when there is no danger of the fire spreading, all inflammable material is removed, and the second growth can come up without serious risk of being destroyed. Even where only part of the brush is burned and the rest is piled, as when the piles in open places, along ridges, streams, or laid off lines are burned, very much is gained in case of fire, since these cleared lanes form bases from which a fire may be fought. Besides lessening the danger from fire, brush burning has certain minor advantages. When the brush on the ground is removed, it is much easier for rangers and others to ride or walk through the forest. This may be very important in case of a fire or in rounding up cattle. It is also much easier to cut and handle ties, cordwood, or other timber which may later be taken from the cut over areas if the slash is out of the way. By piling and burning the green brush as it is cut from the trees by the swampers, as is now being done in Minnesota and parts of Montana, the ground is cleared and skidding is made easier and cheaper. Again, careful piling and burning of brush improves the appearance of the forest. There is nothing more unsightly than a recently cut over area where no attempt has been made to dispose of tops and lops. Near towns or resorts and along roads or streams frequented by tourists, this point should be carefully considered, but as a general rule the utility of the forest should not be sacrificed for beauty. Disadvantages of burning. The disadvantages of burning brush are many and, with the one exception of protection from fire, far outweigh the advantages. If protection can be had in some other way, as with more efficient patrol service or more stringent laws, the practice should in many cases be abandoned. In many places, especially in the yellow pine type, the best and often the only reproduction comes up under a fallen treetop or other brush. Where there is little of the old stand left, the straggling open top protects the seedlings from the direct heat of the sun. Yet brush not only protects the seedlings from the sun, but, what is more important, the leaves and broken twigs form a cover which retards evaporation of moisture from the soil. Over the greater part of the West, the soil dries out very rapidly during the dry season, and this seriously retards or even prevents the growth of seedlings. Even in the moister regions, such as that of the Engelmann spruce type, it is very necessary to conserve the moisture in the soil after logging to prevent the remaining trees from being killed through lack of soil moisture. A third reason why seedlings so often come up only under the downed tree tops is that they are protected from stock. Next to drought, sheep are perhaps the most serious menace to reproduction, and though it would be best to keep all stock off the area for several years after logging, in many cases this is not practicable, and on many areas the leaving of the tops on the ground is the only way to protect reproduction from injury. In many places after the timber has been cut off gullies and washes start in the old wheel ruts, log slides, etc., and these and other forms of erosion can best be prevented by leaving the brush on the ground, either laid in the incipient washes or scattered over the soil that is likely to wash. Brush burning destroys the valuable soil cover, and on the spots where the piles are burned the soil is loosened, which renders it even more liable to erosion. It is well known that where the forest is burned each year, the soil becomes poorer and poorer because nitrogen, the chief fertilizing ingredient of the soil, is given off in the smoke, and only the mineral elements go back to the soil in the ashes. And what is more injurious, the humus, i.e., the decomposed vegetable matter in the topsoil, is destroyed. In burning brush after logging, all the fertilizing and humus-forming leaves and twigs are destroyed just when most needed, for another good crop or leaves cannot be expected for many years. The added cost both to the lumberman and to the government is another argument against brush burning. The cost of piling brush has varied all the way from 15 cents to $1 or more per thousand, with an average of 40 or 50 cents, while the cost of burning may be from 5 cents to 25 cents per thousand, averaging about 15 cents. By abandoning the practice of brush piling, this 60 cents a thousand will not be entirely saved, as is claimed by some, for the brush will still have to be lopped and disposed of in some other way, which will cost, it is estimated, at least half as much as piling and burning. But even a saving of 25 or 30 cents a thousand is a strong argument against the practice. Thus, from a silvicultural viewpoint, the disadvantages of brush burning far outweighs its advantages. Yet, as a general policy, it seems unwise, until other methods have proved their efficiency, to abandon brush piling and burning to any great extent at present. Fire danger is a known quality, and, though it is being reduced each year, it is still a menace. Therefore changes from the present practice should be made with caution. Brush piling and burning is certainly not advisable in all cases, and extensive experiments should be made to determine what is the best method of brush disposal for the different types and conditions. Brush piling and burning. The cost of piling varies with the cost of labor and the methods of logging, the type, the topography, the kind of trees cut, and the time of year it is done. A few figures will illustrate this variation. In the yellow pine type in Montana, an addition to the swampers' wages of 15 cents a thousand would, it is said, enable them to pile the brush, as they have to handle it anyways. Usually, however, the piling is done by a separate crew. Much of the work is thus duplicated. In yellow pine in the Southwest, brush piling costs from 45 to 50 cents, while in Montana it can be done for 25 cents. One operator in lodgepole in Montana says it is cheaper for him to pile than not to, because he can get his skidding done so much cheaper. Yet on other operations it has cost from 50 cents to $1 a thousand, depending on how thoroughly it is cleaned up. In the sugar pine type of California, the cost of piling averages from 25 to 35 cents, while the cost in the Douglas fir type in Montana and Idaho averages about 40 cents, and in Engelmann spruce type the cost is only about 25 cents a thousand. It is certain, however, that the cost of piling will everywhere be materially reduced when the operators begin to look on piling as a part of the swampers' regular work and not as an entirely separate job. Dry brush should never be burned during the dry season, unless absolutely necessary for the suppression of an insect invasion. Green brush in some places may be burned at any time, but as a rule it is unsafe to burn it in dry weather. The best time to burn brush is in the fall, just after the first snowfall. Then the piles are dry, and there is no danger that the fire will get beyond control. Brush may also be burned at the beginning of or during the rainy season, when the ground is damp enough to prevent fire from spreading and the brush dry enough to burn readily. The cost of brush burning varies like the cost of piling. It varies even more in the same localities, with weather conditions and methods of piling. Brush that can be burned for 10 or 15 cents a thousand at a favorable time, as just after the first snow, will cost 5 or 10 times as much to burn in dry weather or when the piles are very wet. Brush can be burned more easily the first fall after cutting than it can the second year, when many of the leaves have fallen off. Brush burning has been done for 13 cents a thousand in lodgepole in the Medicine Bow National Forest, while it has cost 22 cents in similar timber in the Yellowstone, and estimates of 40 cents a thousand have been made for it in the Rockies. It is generally admitted that brush can be most economically burned by the same people who pile it. Recently, several contracts have been made in which the purchaser of the timber is required to pile and burn the brush under the direction of forest officers, as has been the practice in the Minnesota forest for some time. This will lighten the total cost, and when the weather allows the brush to be burned, as logging proceeds, the cost of burning will be offset by the subsequent reduction in the cost of skidding. Piling without burning. Brush piled properly, even though it is not burned, is a great protection to the forest. Inflammable material is removed from among the living trees, and should a fire occur, it would be much easier to fight. This is especially true where reproduction is dense. Where openings are scarce, piles should be made in the most open places, and may be larger than those made to be burned. Slash burning. In many regions, especially in western Oregon and Washington, logging debris is too great to make piling practicable. But except for the damper localities close to the Pacific, the danger from these immense accumulations is all the more excessive, and as we have seen elsewhere, their removal is often desirable in order to further reforestation by desirable species. Here the only course is to burn the slashing clean. This is a dangerous process unless every safeguard is employed. Burning must be at a time in spring or fall when the slashing is dry enough, but the surrounding woods are not. Spring burning is theoretically preferable, for it leaves less inflammable material during the fire season. The first fire is also easier to control then, because repeated experiments may be made as the slashing dries, until just the right conditions exist. On the other hand, it is dangerous if there are many old stumps and logs in which fire may smolder to make trouble later. The exponents or fall burning also argue that with care they can be ready to fire a very dry slashing safely at the beginning of a rainstorm. Spring burning seems to have the most advocates, but it is doubtful whether any rule for all localities and conditions can be given with confidence. Frequently failure at one season leads to postponement until the next. In either case, the slashing can be given the advantage of the greatest dryness with safety if it is surrounded by a cleared fire line from which to work. Firing should be against the wind, and if the wind changes suddenly, the opposite edge should be backfired. Previous cutting of all dead trees and snags over 25 feet high is urgently recommended. The camp crew should be held in readiness, well provided with tools, as insurance against accidental escape. Its probable restriction of insect breeding is a point of slash burning likely to receive much future study. It is well known that most forest-injuring insects prefer dying trees to vigorous ones. Also that the existence of an abnormal amount of such material tends to abnormal breeding and consequent serious attack of vigorous timber when the dead material becomes too dry to be inviting. It is by no means impossible that the supposed immunity of Douglas fir from insect injury may be largely due to the almost universal destruction by fire of logging debris which would otherwise afford ideal breeding places. Fire lines. The division of mature forest into compartments separated by fire lines is seldom practicable in this country. Nevertheless, slashings, deadenings, and similar fire traps can very often be profitably confined by the cleaning of strips which will not only stop or retard the progress of a moderate fire, but also facilitate patrol, firefighting, or backfiring. On favorable ground where some choice is offered, much may be done by falling timber inward so as to leave few tops near the uncut timber and by the location of skid roads. So far as practicable, fire lines should be on the tops of ridges, for being slower to go downhill than up, fire is more easily discouraged just as it reaches a crest. Bottoms of gulches are next in strategic value and mid-slopes least. Safeguarding equipment. The most fruitful source of fires is spark-emitting locomotives and logging engines. Much data has been collected showing that with oil at a reasonable price, its use is economical from a labor-saving point of view as well as from that of safety. It reduces expense for watchmen, patrol, fuel cutting, firebox cleaning, and firing. And since it is an absolute prevention, while all other measures merely seek to minimize the risk, it is probable that even where the cost of the oil more than balances these savings, it will save in the long run by averting a costly fire. Where the use of oil cannot be considered, spark arresters are essential. The argument that they prevent draft is not worth attention. It is greatly exaggerated by engineers and firemen prejudiced against innovation or too attentive to keep their fires up properly, and consequently unnecessarily depend on occasional forced draft. The slight disadvantage involved by the modern improved arrestor is not to be compared with the importance of the safety acquired. In addition to spark arresters, which may fail or be out of order, logging engines using fuel other than oil should be provided with a constant tank or barrel supply of 6 to 12 barrels of water and 100 feet of hose with proper pumping attachment. With this, a spark fire can be promptly soaked out beyond danger of invisible smoldering in rotten wood or duff. When conditions are dangerous, careful loggers send a man back to each donkey setting between supper and bedtime to look for possible fires that were not seen when the crew left. Many keep a watchman on the rounds all night. Railroad rights of way can usually be kept cleaned and burned at a cost far less than that of otherwise frequent shutdowns of the entire camp to fight fire or rebuild bridges, to say nothing of loss of timber. Patrol. The best way to prevent fire is to prevent it. Putting out fires already started is better than letting them burn, but as the real foundation of a protective system, it is about like lowering a lifeboat after the ship has struck. Only by patrol can the incipient spark or campfire be extinguished before it becomes a forest fire that has to be fought, taking hours or days instead of minutes. One patrolman can stop 100 incipient fires easier than 100 men can stop one big fire. Fires in the forest may never be wholly averted, but patrol will prevent them from becoming forest fires. This is why the progressive lumberman no longer waits till forced to lay off his crew to fight, spending in a day or two a patrolman's salary for a season, shutting down his road and mill for lack of logs, and perhaps in spite of all losing several $1,000s worth of timber and equipment. It is also why the progressive non-operating owner no longer considers fire loss the act of God, to be reckoned with as an investment risk of several %. The man who does not patrol his timber nowadays is like a millman who hires no watchman, has no hose or sprinkler equipment, and carries no insurance. He may escape loss, but by not making a reasonable effort to insure against it, he takes a course practically unknown with other forms of property. Modern fire patrol is systematic. Trained and organized men have definite duties. Tools, assistance, and supplies are available at known points and without delay. Trails and lookout stations, often supplemented by telephone lines, give the greatest efficiency with the least number of men. Above all, the system is based on the fact that results are most truly measured not by the number of fires extinguished, but by the absence of fire at all. Settlers, campers, and lumbermen are visited, cautioned, and converted. In short, the patrolman has a certain area in which to improve public sentiment. His success in this is worth more than efficiency in fighting fires due to lack of such success. A system devoted to mere fire fighting to be adequate must grow larger as time goes on. One devoted to preventing fire may be reduced as time makes it successful. The cost of efficient patrol varies so directly with the risk that it is almost constant as an insurance investment. Where prevalence of fire, difficulty of handling it, etc., make the cost per acre comparatively high, there is equivalent certainty of greater loss if this sum is not spent. Where the owner is warranted in believing his risk small, it costs but a trifle to provide sufficient patrol to insure against it. 1 to 3 cents an acre is spent in the great majority of successful patrols in ordinary seasons. Associate effort. One of the first lessons learned from the establishment of private patrol in the West was that both efficiency and economy are obtained by cooperation between owners. Obviously, if one patrolman can cover the holdings of several, it is foolish for each to hire a man. If a fire threatens several tracts, it is better to share the expense of labor hired to put it out. The same is true of building trails, buying tool supplies, etc. This has led to the forming of associations at which a minimum cost to each member accomplish the many tasks of finding suitable men, having them authorized by the state, supervising and supplying them, paying emergency expense, opening trails, etc. Each member pays his share upon the acreage he represents. These associations offer other important advantages besides the mere cheapening of work. They are admirably adapted to modifying the cost to fit the season. Beginning in spring with an assessment to cover putting the whole territory under the essentials of supervision and patrol, they can add men just as required by the progress of dry weather and reduce again in the fall. Men can be centralized at danger points better than through individual effort. Exceedingly important is the means they afford of bringing in the non-resident owner, the small owner who is not warranted in employing anyone alone, and the non-progressive owner who would otherwise do nothing but is ashamed to stay out of a general movement. No tract can be safely considered as an independent unit. No protection confined to it alone is as good insurance as the removal of risk from the district in which it lies. Fire is no respecter of section lines. There is always danger of unusual weather in which it may travel a long distance. It is far better to secure the maximum general safety in the locality than to have guarded tracks alternating with fire traps. Moreover, attention to individual tracks does not improve surrounding conditions, and the latter may easily become so bad as to make the cost of individual patrol, as well as the risk, far overbalance any financial disadvantage at present through cooperation. Again, the public is far more likely to take kindly to the enforcement of fire laws by an association than to the action of an individual owner against whom some prejudice may exist. Associations greatly simplify cooperation with state and government in fire work and tend to bring about appropriations for the purpose. They enable uniform and concentrated effort to improve sentiment and legislation. This booklet and the other work done by the Western Forestry and Conservation Association was made possible by the existence of the local organizations it represents. Their independent local and state effect has been marked. The bad fire season of 1910 was a supreme test of the associations of the Pacific Northwest. They kept the bad fires in their immense territory down to a number which can be counted on the fingers, and their losses were comparatively insignificant. Yet under the weather conditions which existed, the thousands of fires they extinguished would certainly otherwise have swept the country and caused a disaster probably unparalleled in American history. Reforestation as a fire preventative. However progressive the preventative policies adopted, the race between them and the increasing sources of hazard resembles that between armor plate and ordnance in the construction of battleships. While for a given population engaged in pursuits endangering the forests the risk lessens, the total activity increases at a rate which makes the smaller proportionate risk as great in actual measure. This is particularly true of the growth of slashing areas. The virgin forest becomes more and checkered by burned and cut over deadenings, veritable fire traps open to sun and wind, and especially west of the Cascades, usually covered by inflammable debris, brush or dead ferns. Each year brings nearer the time when, unless something is done, such will constitute the majority of once forested land, and the uncut timber will remain like islands in expanses of extreme danger. Next to cultivation, which but a small percentage will receive, the safest insurance against recurring fires in these cut-over areas is a thrifty young second growth. It shades the ground, keeps out annual vegetation that furnishes fuel when dead, and will itself carry none but such furious crown fires as would be practically unknown were there no openings for them to gain headway in. This is less true of pine, but the very best protection which can be given a tract of merchantable fir is a strip of 10 to 50-year second growth surrounding it. Whether regarded from the owner's standpoint or that of the public, reforestation should be considered as a protective measure of extreme importance. Actual expenditure to obtain it may easily be profitable for this reason alone, for once established it will decrease the cost of patrol thereafter. Were all cut-over land in the Northwest immediately restocked, the fire hazard would be enormously reduced. End of section 8. Section 9 of Practical Forestry in the Pacific Northwest by Edward Tyson Allen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Forestry and the Farmer. Cutting methods. If there is anyone for whom the practice of forestry is practical and profitable, it is the farmer who owns the timber he uses for fuel and other purposes. His supply of the most suitable material is almost always limited, and in any case his method of using it is practically certain to influence his permanent labor expenses. Nevertheless, especially in well-timbered regions, cutting is apt to be with but two considerations: the quickest clearing of land, or the easiest immediate fulfillment of some need for tree products, and the passage of a few years brings realization that this early thoughtlessness must be paid for at a high price. In the first place, almost all timber of a commercial species has real and increasing value. If it is young, this value is increasing doubly because of growth. Varying greatly, of course, young timber in the Pacific Northwest very often adds from 500 to 1,000 board feet to the acre annually. This annual gain is taking place even if the timber has not reached merchantable size, being like coin deposited in a toy bank which does not open until full. And this is true whether the ultimate use may be for fuel, poles, or saleable material like tie or saw timber. Too much land is cleared of young growth, merely because such clearing is easy, which is of such low value for tilling or even pasture that its use for these purposes does not pay as well in the long run as would its use for growing timber, especially when the investment of clearing is considered. The resulting expanse of charred stumps and logs, producing little but ferns, is a small farm asset at best. The timber it would grow may eventually be a large asset. And the labor of clearing applied to a smaller tract of good land is sure to bring greater returns. An illustration is furnished by 2 tracks near the end of a recently completed railroad in western Washington. 20 years ago a settler slashed a large area of presumably worthless sapling fir adjoining his tillable bottom land, set fire to it, piled and burned the remaining poles, seeded down a pasture and enclosed it by an expensive cedar rail fence. The pasture, never useful except in early spring, grew up to ferns and was finally abandoned. Even the fence was moved. The settler on the next claim left his part of the same sapling growth to grow, and this year sold the timber alone for $1,000 to a tie mill which came into the neighborhood with the railroad. The moral of this does not apply to cutting alone, but argues equally for preventing fire in second growth. It is also poor economy if mature timber exists to cut rapidly growing young timber for fuel, because it is nearer the house or easier to cut. The former has become stationary in production, while the latter, if left, is earning money by growing in quantity and quality. If young timber must be used and the land is not worth actually clearing for cultivation or pasture, it is usually far better to thin out the poorest trees, thus leaving the remainder stimulated to a more rapid growth, which will soon replace those removed, than to begin on the edge and take everything. There is no reason why a certain poor soiled timbered portion of the average claim should not be considered as a permanent wood lot, to be treated with the same interest and pride in making it produce the greatest quantity of forest products for sale or use that the owner accords his fields. With this point of view established and consequent study given the subject, it will also be easier to decide how large this portion should be. In many cases the result will be abandonment of the area that all forest growth is an enemy, to be destroyed on general principles without calculating what actual profit there is in destruction. Another point often overlooked in the Pacific Northwest, because of our local tendency to consider the forest only as something to struggle against, is the exactly opposite influence of properly placed tree growth upon sale values if the prospective buyer is from the east or from our own cities or tree-less regions. Such are attracted strongly by the grove-like effect of a few trees left around the house. Their desire for this is as strongly ingrained as the average local resident's desire for a completely free outlook to mark his victory over unfriendly nature. The appeal a place makes to a buyer as a pleasant home has frequently as important an influence on his decision as its purely practical merits. His judgment of the latter, however, is also affected by his earlier environment. If he has lived where farming land is open, evidences of the labor of clearing are discouraging. The untouched forest, being totally beyond his capacity to estimate the labor its removal entails, repels him less than stumps, logs, desolate burnings, and other like detailed evidences of the work which lies before him. This is another reason why the clearing of clearly fertile land may be better business than the half clearing of land perhaps best suited for forest growth anyway. Again, not fully realizing the plentifulness of forest products in the new locality, he may actually overestimate the value of an attractive piece of forest land, showing evidence of the thoughtful care suggested in a preceding paragraph. Use of fire. Above all, it pays the settler in wooded regions to be careful with fire. Properly directed and confined, fire is necessary in clearing land. But there is no profit in allowing uncontrolled fire to spread from the actual clearing to create a snarl of dead, decaying, and falling trees and underbrush. It is usually harder to extend the clearing into such ground than into green timber. This added work later is many times that necessary to safeguard the burning in the first place. In every case that fire has ever escaped from clearing operations, the cause was either thoughtlessness or unwillingness to perform certain work. Because it is easier to burn a slashing than to pile and burn, or when a ground burn is desirable, because it is easier to take chances than to clear a fire line around the area and have a force of men present, because burning at a dry, dangerous time will be cleaner and thus save work after the fire, inexperience, coupled with unwillingness to take advice from the experienced, these and like reasons are responsible for the destruction of lives and property worth over and over again the sum that was saved by the attempted economy. And although this does not save others, the person responsible also usually loses instead of gaining. Without deprecating in the least the importance of agricultural development, or of lightening the useful and not easy task of the settler, it is still terribly true that the agricultural industry and the settler suffer an annual loss through the destruction of improvements, crops and stock by fires from careless clearing that is far greater financially than the saving in clearing cost which was the cause. In other words, agricultural development is retarded instead of advanced by its present careless use of fire. Planting for fuel and timber. Great as are the timber resources of the Pacific Northwest, there are extensive regions in central and eastern Oregon and Washington where timber is a scarcity, and wood for fuel and farm repair purposes for settlers and ranchers can be attained only at heavy cost. In such situations it will be a paying investment for the farmer to set out a small plantation simply to produce his own wood for fuel, fence posts, and other purposes. It is true that some time must elapse before plantations begin to be productive, but by choosing rapid growing species and planting closely, the thinnings which will be necessary in a few years, even though the trees be small, will do for the woodpile. Trees which grow rapidly and at the same time produce good wood are, of course, preferable. If they also sprout from the stump, a little care will maintain the supply indefinitely. The choice of species for a woodlot must be governed to a great extent by the location. Many portions of the treeless areas in this region are situated at a high altitude where the climatic conditions are severe and frosts are common throughout every month of the year. In such locations only the most hardy trees will succeed. Other areas are deficient in moisture, and where this deficiency is so great as to prohibit the growing of agricultural crops by dry farming, it is useless to attempt growing trees without irrigation. Probably the tree most commonly planted in treeless regions has been some species of cottonwood. Lombardy poplar and balm of Gilead have been great favorites. Cottonwood grows rapidly and is hardy against frost, but requires a never failing supply of water within 5 to 20 feet of the surface. Because of its demands for moisture, it will not grow on uplands, but thrives along watercourses or where there is plentiful supply of moisture below the surface. Its fuel value is not high, though the quantity of its wood production compensates for its poor quality, nor does it make good fence posts. Where quick growth is the main consideration, however, it is a good tree to plant. The varieties known as Norway and Carolina poplar are the best. Green ash and hackberry are also hardy against both cold and moisture, but of slow growth. Their wood is durable in contact with the soil, making them suitable for fence posts. Where it succeeds, black locust combines many of the desirable qualities to the highest degree. It is a rapid grower, makes excellent fence posts, and has high fuel value. It is not as hardy against frost as cottonwood and ash, and while it has been planted successfully in sheltered locations on high plateaus, its success where frosts occur during the summer months is problematical. A closely related species, honey locust, is more frost hardy but less desirable in other respects, though an excellent tree nevertheless. Other fairly hardy and drought-resistant trees are Osage orange and Russian mulberry. Their value for fuel and fence posts is high, but they will not succeed in the most severe situations. Box elder is hardy and has been widely planted, but it is of low fuel value and short-lived. In favorable localities at low altitudes where moisture is abundant either through natural precipitation or from irrigation, the number of species which are adapted to woodlot planting is largely increased. Black walnut, black cherry, and hardy catalpa are probably the most valuable of these. The latter, however, is sensitive to early and late frosts. Windbreaks. The planting of windbreaks and shelter belts around dwellings and fields is of prime importance to the settler in an open country. Nothing adds more to the comfort of the dweller than a belt of timber about the home to protect it from the wind. Orchards need windbreaks to save them from injury in a wind-swept country, and gardens are more successful when surrounded by trees. One of the most important functions of the windbreak, however, is the saving of soil moisture within the protected area, for it is a well-established fact that evaporation takes place more rapidly when there is a movement of the atmosphere than when it is calm. It is safe to say that a windbreak is effective in preventing evaporation for a distance equal to 10 to 15 times its height. Some species, because of the form of their crowns and their rapid growth, are more effective for windbreaks than others. Since more coniferous trees regain their foliage through the entire year, they afford protection in the winter as well as in the summer. Such species as western yellow, Scotch and Austrian pine grow rapidly, are hardy, and serve the purpose well. In regions of abundant moisture, Douglas fir or Norway and Sitka spruce are unequaled. European larch has also been very successful in many regions, but, unlike most conifers, it sheds its leaves in winter. Where a windbreak is to consist of a single row only, it should be of a densely growing type that branches close to the ground. For low breaks of this character, the Russian mulberry and Osage orange are excellent. Trees for woodlot or windbreak planting can be purchased from commercial nurserymen or grown by the farmer. Many growers of orchard trees, particularly in the states in the Middle West, do a large business in forest tree seedlings. Since the transportation charges are often high, and since most farmers can give the attention and labor necessary to raising the trees themselves without inconvenience or extra expense, it is often desirable for them to do so. The Forest Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture has issued several publications containing full directions for the establishment of nurseries, and these can be obtained from the Superintendent of Public Documents, Washington, D.C., free, or at a nominal cost. Planting may be done in the spring or fall, the latter being often preferable in regions where a dry season occurs early in the summer. For plantations of broadleaf species, 1-year-old seedlings are best suited, while coniferous species should be 2 to 3 years old. The chief points to remember in setting out the trees are not to allow the roots, particularly of coniferous trees, to dry out, to dig the holes large enough to enable the roots to take a normal position without doubling up, and to pack the soil firmly around them. Where planting is done on open ground, it is highly advantageous to plow and harrow the soil before setting out the trees in order to preserve the moisture and kill weeds and sod. Willows, cottonwoods, and other poplars are very easily propagated from cuttings. Cuttings should be of strong, healthy wood of the previous season's growth, which ripened well and did not shrivel during the winter. A good length is 8 to 12 inches, with the upper cut just above a bud. They may be made when wanted and planted with a spade, or if the ground is mellow they can be merely shoved into the soil until only one bud is above the surface, and then tramped. The spacing of the trees is a question largely of utility, with some variation for different species. In general, however, close planting is advisable in treeless regions, since an artificial forest must stand in a dense mass if it is to succeed in the struggle against native vegetation, wind, sunrise, frost, and dry weather. A single tree or row unprotected by associates has a poorer chance. Cultivation is the best method of conserving soil moisture. To obtain the best results, plantations should be cultivated if possible at least during the first few years. The less care the trees are to have, the thicker they should be set in order that they will be close enough to establish forest conditions of shade, litter, and underbrush. Thinnings can then be made as they grow and need more room. The material thus obtained will provide an early supply of fuel, stakes, and posts. A spacing of 4 by 4 feet is common, but this does not allow for cultivation. For this reason, 2 by 8 feet is preferable. Shelter belts should be planted closely in order to give protection quickly. Cost. The cost of planting is not great. Broadleaf seedlings will cost from $1 to $6 per thousand at the nursery, coniferous plants $2.50 to $10. If grown at home, the cost will be greatly reduced. The preparation of the soil by plowing and harrowing should not exceed $2 per acre, and planting from $2.50 to $5 per thousand, according to the species, the method used, and the condition of the soil. End of section 9.